A few weeks ago, it was revealed that actress Yerin Ha would be playing the role of Sophie Beckett in Season 4 of Bridgerton. But who exactly is Sophie, and why is she such an important character in this new season? In this video, we'll dive into her background and origins, exploring her story before she meets Benedict Bridgerton. Sophie's story begins on a rainy July night when she was just 3 years old. She was left at the doorstep of a grand house in Penwood Park, wearing nothing but a large coat and carrying a small note in her pocket, the only clue to her identity. Her mother wasn't there when this happened. In fact, Sophie had been brought there by her maternal grandmother, an elderly woman who seemed very ill. It's unclear why they abandoned Sophie. Maybe the note left with her explained it, but that note was burned in the fireplace as soon as it reached its intended recipient. Still, for the most part, Sophie was welcomed into her new home. That rainy night, she was found by the housekeeper of the Earl of Penwood, a man named Richard Gunningworth, who was undoubtedly her father, though he never admitted it outright. Instead, he claimed she was the orphaned daughter of an old friend. But it was obvious, and the servants knew the truth. Sophie had the same moss-green eyes, the same dark blonde hair. Her face resembled the Earl's mother's, and her smile was identical to her paternal aunt's. But no one said anything. No one wanted to hurt Sophie's feelings or risk their jobs by pointing out the resemblance. After Sophie arrived at the house, the Earl ordered a room to be prepared for her near the children's quarters, and that's where she stayed. He called her Sophia, and she called him my lord, and they only saw each other a few times a year when he visited the estate from London, which wasn't often. But the most surprising thing was that Sophie knew she was a bastard. She didn't remember much from her life before arriving at Penwood Park, but she recalled a long carriage ride across England, and she remembered her frail grandmother telling her, through coughing fits, that she was going to live with her father. And more than anything, she remembered standing at that door in the rain, knowing her grandmother was hiding in the bushes, waiting to see if Sophie would be taken inside. The Earl lifted her chin, bringing her face into the light, and in that moment, they both knew the truth. Life for Sophie carried on, and although she didn't have her father's affection, she made do with his distant and almost absent presence. That was, at least, until he decided to get married. Sophie thought it was good news. She was thrilled when she found out. The Earl getting married meant he'd spend more time at Penwood Park, which meant he'd be around her more often. And while she didn't exactly miss him when he was away, it was hard to miss someone who barely noticed her when he was around. She thought that maybe, just maybe, if she got to know him better, she might miss him. And if she got to know him better, maybe he wouldn't leave so often. Besides, her new stepmother had 2 daughters, which seemed even better because Sophie would finally have people her age to talk to. Unlike the other children in the district, she was never invited to local parties or gatherings. No one ever called her a bastard to her face. Doing so would have been the same as calling the Earl a liar. After declaring Sophie his ward and under his protection, the Earl never brought up the subject again. But at the same time, he didn't make much effort to get her accepted by society. So, by the age of 10, her best friends were the servants and footmen, and her real parents could have easily been the housekeeper and the butler. But at last, she was going to have sisters. Well, she couldn't technically call them sisters because she wasn't the Earl's daughter, but she could at least think of them that way. And that was more than enough. And so, one February afternoon, Sophie found herself standing in the grand entrance hall with all the gathered servants, waiting, watching through the window for the Earl's carriage to arrive, bringing with it the new Countess and her 2 daughters, and, of course, the Earl. The day the Earl returned to Penwood with his new family marked a turning point in Sophie's life, though not in a good way. The then 10-year-old waited eagerly for the new Countess to arrive, whispering prayers that the woman would love her. Maybe if the Countess loved her, the Earl might too. And even if he never called her his daughter, he might at least treat her like one, and then they could be a real family. But that didn't happen. Upon arriving, the Countess immediately realized Sophie wasn't just a ward, and refused to let her daughters associate with her, or at least refused to let Sophie feel like she was on the same level as them. The Countess Araminta tried to convince the Earl to keep Sophie away from her daughters, but he stood firm in his decision that the three girls should be treated equally, at least in terms of comfort. On the first day of lessons, Araminta ordered the governess to leave her alone with Sophie and proceeded to intimidate her, making Sophie's position as a mere bastard painfully clear. She grabbed Sophie's chin, digging her nails into it, and forced her to look her in the eye, ordering her never to forget what she was or to think for a second that she was worth as much as they were, because she wasn't. Araminta forbade her from speaking to her or her daughters, let alone coming near them. Later, Sophie learned that Araminta had pushed for her to be expelled from the house from day one. But the Earl refused. He calmly told her that she didn't need to love Sophie or even like her, but she did need to tolerate her. He had taken responsibility for the girl for 7 years and wasn't about to abandon her now. Following Araminta's lead, Rosamond and Posy treated Sophie with hostility and disdain, though it was clear Posy's heart wasn't inclined to cruelty the way Rosamond's was. There was nothing Rosamond enjoyed more than pinching Sophie and twisting the skin on the back of her hand when the governess wasn't looking. And so the next 4 years passed, until one day, unexpectedly, the Earl died. With no male heir, despite Araminta's efforts, she never conceived. The title and estates passed to a distant cousin. The late Earl had left a will. Most of his bequests were standard: gifts to loyal servants, funds for Rosamond, Posy, and even Sophie, ensuring respectable dowries for all 3 girls. Then the lawyer read Araminta's name. "To my wife, Araminta Gunningworth, Countess of Penwood, I leave an annual income of £2,000, unless she agrees to house, protect, and care for my ward, Miss Sophia Maria Beckett, until she reaches the age of 20, in which case the annual income will be tripled to £6,000. Araminta grudgingly accepted, but she kept certain key details, like the dowry the Earl had left for Sophie, to herself. And so, Sophie lived the next several years with Araminta, Rosamond, and Posy, but not as one of them. Well, she was, but only as another servant. Sophie was responsible for cleaning, polishing the floors, cooking, and attending to the needs of the 3 unbearable women. She had no idea her father had left her money. All she knew was that he had ensured Araminta would take her in until she turned 20, and for that, she was grateful, however little it was. And even though she had turned 20, the fear of finding something worse out on the streets kept her from leaving the house. Araminta had allowed her to stay, eat, and sleep there as long as she continued to serve her, and Sophie hadn't thought twice about it. So, for the last 6 years of her life after her father's death, she lived as nothing more than another servant, scorned and humiliated, until one fateful night. The night her true family, the household staff, helped her attend the masquerade ball that would change her life forever. Let me know in the comments which other character you'd like us to talk about on the channel. And remember, if you enjoy this type of video, the best way to support me is by leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. See you in the next video.